Hey, this is Torrin Walker. If you like Context Media Group, help us to keep telling stories. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Wednesday Wisdom. This is Torrin Walker, and today my guest is Dr. Roderick Graham. Dr. Graham is an associate professor of sociology and criminal justice at Old Dominion. He's also the coordinator of Old Dominion's cyber criminology bachelor's program. So, Dr. Graham, how are you doing today?
I'm all right. Thanks for having me.
All right. For people who may not understand what algorithms are and how that factors into algorithmic bias and bias in tech, can you give people a brief rundown of what exactly an algorithm is and how they affect culture?
Well, in the simplest sense, an algorithm is a computer program that takes in information, makes some calculations, and spits out something that humans can use, actionable intelligence. And so whenever I'm describing it to people or my students, I always start with something like a credit score, because everyone knows what that is. So a credit score is based on a number of factors, your employment history, your credit history, maybe not really your employment history, possibly, but the number of credit inquiries and many other factors. And so the algorithm takes that information and uses some kind of formula to produce a number that's meant to predict whether or not you're a good credit risk or a bad one. And so that's all algorithms are. It's not only the number, but it's also some evaluation of good or bad, right? So if you're between 800 and 700, you're considered something. If you're between 700 or 600 on your credit score, you're considered something else. So that's all algorithms are.
Mm-hmm. And those algorithms factor in what's known as machine learning, right? Like a set number of algorithms over a specific population gets fed into a system and it becomes sort of like a value system on what human beings can move and how they can move in society, correct?
It's something like that. I think in everyday language, we say artificial intelligence, but the computer doesn't really have much intelligence. Instead, what it does is it learns from the past and then uses past patterns to make predictions about future patterns, and it sort of takes on a life of its own. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And all those patterns are created by human beings. Can you talk a little bit about how a human being's cultural bias may influence what algorithms and what data is fed into that machine?
Yeah, you're selecting what is important. So the thing that a lot of scholars and activists are concerned about is bias as it relates to the criminal justice system. So some of the more popular algorithms, we call them, like for policing, we call them hotspot algorithms, where it predicts where the hotspots of crime will be using past data. Well, you decide what you think will be a hotspot, or what matters to be a hotspot. And so you may take, and it seems logical, right? Like you'll look at what happened in 2020, what time and place, what type of crime, and you say, well, if it happened in 2020 at this place, then it'll probably happen in 2021 at that same place at the same time. So you send police there to deal with that issue. So it sounds good. The problem is, it's often the case that the reason why that crime occurred is because of a lot of past racist practices. Maybe because you put police in that area in 2018, 2019, because you're like, well, Black people are here, they're going to commit a lot of crime, so let's just go in that area. So of course you're going to collect a lot of data about that area, and then you try and use it in an algorithm and make it seem like it's objective, but it's not. All it's doing is just building in the racist practices from the past.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that happens because there's sort of like an aversion for people in the tech sector to even talk about the fact that their culture and the culture around technology may be influenced by someone's inherent biases?
It is. It is. It's. I don't necessarily think that most folks in tech are trying to be biased, but they have a lot of belief in the technology being objective. And even if you do research showing them that it's not really that objective, they still say, well, it's a computer. It's got to be objective. We can just fix it. We can just fix it. So some of that is a problem in the tech industry.
The tech industry is overwhelmingly white and male. Um, Every time there's been a conversation about trying to diversify tech, there's been a lot of pushback from the establishment in the tech world because they say that they deal with numbers, they deal with data, and the person's culture doesn't have anything to enter into that, and it doesn't have anything to do with that. Do you think that there's almost like an obsession with technology to the point that you can take out the human element and people have bought into that?
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. I also think that the tech industry is a reflection of society at large. So I have a lot of conversations with people, probably too much on social media, and I try to get them to understand that, as individuals, we're biased, and it's hard to game that out with computers. Also, society is systemically racist, and if you try and act as if things are colorblind and just move on from that, you're going to just simply accept the bias without thinking about it, and that often happens. So it happens in society at large, and it also happens with the tech industry. It's just
Um,
simply a lack of awareness, man, about how race matters in everyday life. And if you're not aware of it, then you're not going to code that into your systems.
There's also a conversation that's being had about technology being used to create a different form of historic scientific racism. We've seen the disparities in the health industry due to the rise of data being used to predict someone's health patterns. We've seen racism in tech being used to make comments about people's intelligence based upon class and also around race. Do you see any kind of pushback against that being happening from inside the industry, or is it going to have to happen from people outside pushing back against these ideas?
Well, I think so. On that line, I can't speak so much about the tech industry. I'm not in the tech industry, even though I'll write about it and stuff. Certainly, when it comes to using computers to understand things like genetics and genetic background, scientific racism is a way, as you mentioned. I think there has been a rise in that. People see the ability of computers to understand the human genome, and then find out where certain populations are, and then try and attach that to why Black people are not doing as well in American society as white folks. This is happening, but there's been pushback, man. I mean, I can say that's been one of the more positive developments in academia, is that you have these few folks who want to use genes to try and explain human behavior, but you have most folks who are like, no, this is just pseudoscience. This isn't actually what's happening, and you're imposing your racist values onto the data.
Mhm. Why do you think that those ideas have been able to gain so much traction in academia in the first place?
It hasn't gained that much, but there are people who want to talk about it, and I think it's because they want to justify racial inequality. That they see these differences. So IQ is a big thing, right? So it's not. So I guess technically you could call the IQ score something like an algorithm, but not really. But it gets to this idea of how it works. So people want to try and justify the fact that you see white folks and to some extent Asian immigrants who are dominating in a certain sector. And instead of dealing with some of these issues of racism and historical racism and in institutional racism, where whites are going to better schools, black people are not, they want a better, easy example that justifies why this is without making any political changes. This is my take on it. And so IQ is a perfect example, because you will see, if you try and measure IQ, that you will have white folks scoring higher on average, not all the time, but on average, of course, than black folks.
Well, isn't that also sort of kind of like defends the idea of a cultural bias? Because if the tests you're taking to test IQ are based in Eurocentric ideas, and they're using ideas that in history that are tied to European history, but not really giving any kind of information about African history or Asian history or Latin American history, wouldn't that automatically mean that the IQ score is going to be higher because you know those subjects?
A lot of scholars who study IQ and testing point to the fact that they're culturally biased in many ways, even ways that we don't always think about. So yeah, you're right. The actual test is biased in some ways, but also before you get to the test, you have this interrelationship between the amount of money and wealth you have in your home and the amount of connections you have and understanding of the educational system and preparing your kids for the test. So if you're a middle class or upper class person And you're also embedded in these networks, which are often white networks, where they understand this whole testing process. Okay, so then you know, all right, I got to prepare my kid for something 10, 15 years later. So I'm going to start in preschool, really investing in that kid's education. So then when it comes to test taking in 11th, 12th grade year, or even earlier, they're ready for it. And then you have a Black kid who, even if his parents have some sort of income, a stable home, if they didn't grow up in a situation or they're around people where they understand how the educational system works, they're not going to know how to game that system to cultivate that knowledge in their kids so that when they take that test later, they'll do well.
Do you think that the accumulation of all this data from IQ to SAT scores to test scores to cultural scores, as far as like what people may know about a certain culture over another, do you think that all this data put together kind of gives people a way to distance themselves from dealing with algorithmic bias and dealing with bias in general, and saying that the data holds up and this is what we're dealing with without dealing with the cultural issues?
Oh yes, that's a big part of it. It happens intentionally, like I mentioned with the scientific racists. They don't want changes in society. I mean, some people are very unhappy with this whole anti-racist focus that we've gotten over the past 5 or 10 years. And so they want to push back against that. And they think science is a quote unquote objective way of doing it. And then some of it's just subconscious. So, and at my university, I am the coordinator of a cybercrime program. So I see all of the students who want to be cybercrime majors. It's just computers and criminology put together, cybercrime. All right, so we had an algorithm in our, it's some kind of software that when a student comes in and I go to advise that student, I'll see their risk for doing well in the major. Okay, now someone like me, I'm aware that those risk factors aren't simply about those students. It's also where they went to school. It's also about the quality of their school. It's about the classes they took in high school, which is all racial in many ways. Okay, so a person who may not be consciously racist, they'll just look at the risk score, and it's easy for them. Oh, you're a low risk for this major. Consider doing something else. However, in my case, because I'm aware of how race is baked into those measures, I can be a little more careful and say, look, you know what, you didn't take the classes that you need. That doesn't mean that you can't do well. Tell me about what you're doing now in school. Tell me about your patterns now. Okay, it looks like you can do okay. You can overcome that slow start. So, go ahead with the major.
Do you think that there's been a resistance to bringing that human element into discussing what someone might be qualified for or not?
I think so. I think, a lot of it is going back to that whole colorblind idea, right? It's like, okay, they're the numbers. It's just showing that you got a bad credit score, man. I'm sorry, this you don't qualify for this loan. And so this isn't 1950 where you got the banker who is a part of the community and they know this person. Oh, he's Mr. Johnson's kid. Okay, I might give him a shot. No, the guy just looks at your credit score and says, no, you can't get the loan. And it's easy and it seems fair, right? So there isn't a whole lot of pushback against it. I mean, you really have to have certain people who are really thinking carefully about these things to get that kind of pushback.
All right. I want to touch on the subject that you mentioned earlier about policing along with scientific racism. There is a very big conversation happening in law enforcement circles about the value of predictive policing. There was an issue a couple of years ago with this company Palantir that was selling software to police departments, basically saying that you could predict where a crime was going to be committed, and you could also predict which people were going to commit those crimes.
Mm-hmm.
We've had 4 years of protests against police brutality, and there have been studies done by the Justice Department about inherent bias within police departments. Can you talk a little bit about the danger of predictive policing when we're dealing with a police culture that already sees African Americans and people of color as criminal?
Well, first, it'll justify their bias because it'll be like, well, here's the numbers, right? There are more crimes committed here last year. And so, look, I'm sorry, but we need to go in this neighborhood. It leads to over policing. By the way, I should mention that there's a difference. It's important, a difference between arrest and crime. So we're talking here about crime, but in actuality, the data that is used in these algorithms is about arrests. And so that's important. So it could be that, all right, you've got two neighborhoods, one black, one white, and because of past racist practices of over policing in the black neighborhood, you get a lot more arrests, but the actual crime rate could be the same. So one of the more famous cases, and so the algorithms, to get to your point a little bit, won't necessarily be able to take that into account because they're not collecting that data, or they can't. So they're using arrests. All right. So one of the more famous cases of this was in Oakland, where people on the ground, researchers, and just anecdotal evidence, they knew that the actual use of drugs was higher in white areas of Oakland as opposed to black areas of Oakland. However, because of past police practices, aided now by the algorithm they had in place, I don't know if it's the same one that you mentioned, but it could have been. So the police now are going into that neighborhood and arresting a whole lot of people for drugs. So it looks like it's fair, but it's not. The crime rates are more in the white neighborhood, but the arrest rates could be more in the black. And that's an extreme example. It doesn't always break down that clearly, but it does happen sometimes.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about pushback from inside these industries. Do you think that in the future, in the very near future, that you might see people being more vocal about some of the bias that they're dealing with inside these companies that gather information, and people who work for big data corporations? Like there was a situation a couple of months ago where a couple of people who were hired for a couple of companies, Black women, went public about the fact that they were basically marginalized and tokenized, and they were just hired because they wanted to keep everybody quiet about the lack of diversity in companies. Do you think that some of the people who get these positions are going to eventually gather enough power or enough courage to be able to be outspoken about moving some of these needles?
I don't know, man. That's kind of tough, brother. I mean, those were some very, and I know those women. Both were at Google, I believe. Yeah. And so those were some very strong and very women who were very principled. I'm not entirely sure if that's going to happen much, and the reason is because it's about money. So those police algorithms, and this is actually a problem that has to be dealt with. Those were private companies that were selling their software with the algorithms in it to police departments. So if you're inside of one of those companies and you're making a nice salary from producing those algorithms or working on, what's the incentive for you speaking out? I'm not entirely sure if many people would do that. So it would be nice. So to me, the pushback is going to come from outside. And it comes from outside of those companies with academics and activists who know what's going on the ground.
All right. Speaking of outside, we've seen the power of social media over the past 4 to 5 years too. Social media's had the power to elect presidents, to impeach presidents, to put light on information that would otherwise be ignored by mainstream media. But we've also seen how that information can be manipulated. The issues with Facebook, some of the things that were going on with Twitter. How can people who feel like they're being marginalized use social media to kind of move some of this information into the public?
Interestingly, in my past research, I did research on Black Twitter, and it showed, at least at that time, that was like 4 years ago. To me, it was the marginalized groups who were taking the most advantage of social media because they were the most vocal. They would produce ideas and share them more, and they would eventually become a part of the mainstream. So a lot of this QAnon stuff, that's a marginalized group. But because they're so vocal, they share each other's information. They actually have more power than the mainstream person who doesn't care about whatever the craziness that QAnon is talking about. So, the problem actually is not marginalized groups in that case. It's just that if a group is spreading disinformation, how do you judge whether the information is true or not? That's pretty tough.
Mm-hmm. And that goes into another question. You can deal with data, you can deal with the numbers, but once those numbers are tied to an emotional appeal that people want to believe, do you think that overweighs whatever the data is giving them? Because you can give someone a statistic or a fake statistic doesn't even really exist, but if people want to believe it, they can make it have, they can put weight on it. How do you think, what's the best way to counter that sort of thing?
It's hard, man. It really is, because you're right. People will believe what they want to believe. And the statistic doesn't have to be entirely wrong. It could just be a small slice of the whole pie. So when the George Floyd stuff started last year, in the early part of 2020, okay, there was all this stuff coming out about police brutality, all kinds of numbers, all kinds of data. And I was a part of those conversations. I was just really interested in this, you know. And so some people would point out a simple study done, one study out of 1,000, saying that, oh, you know what? It's not that Black folk are killed at the same rate or more than white folks. In actuality, they're killed at the same, and maybe white folks are killed a little more. Okay. Now, I could try and counter that by saying, look, you're not looking at things like the history of police brutality, not looking at over-aggressive policing, tasing, all these other things that, including killings, led to all those protests. Okay, well, that data is not something they want. So they'll just stick to that one study done by this one academic saying that, okay, no, that's not true. It's just very difficult, man, to break through that. I think for me, one of the things that I've been trying to do post tenure is to write publicly about this and try to make it so that we see a common goal. So people are attaching to data because it benefits them. And so the only way to deal with that is to say, okay, yeah, you know, you might want to believe this particular thing, but if you work from this reality, we can all benefit together. That's hard to do, but I think that's the only way.
All right, and last question. What do you see as the future of algorithms now that the public is becoming more aware of how they affect their lives? Do you see companies beginning to shape those algorithms to look like the larger population, or do you think things are going to continue the way they are?
No, they're not going to continue. So the algorithms will get better. And in my opinion, I think that we need to use algorithms. We just have to be smart about it. There's a lot of benefits, man. So like with the policing, for example, it is the case that that algorithms can make you more efficient. Instead of just spreading out police cars or just doing it based on intuition, you can have some sense of where crimes are going to occur, and you can marshal your resources in that area. Now, if you do that, then it might mean that you can get that kind of defund thing started, where you can reduce some of the funds that are going directly into violence workers, which are what police are, and you can start taking some of those funds and putting it into maybe some sort of preventative measures or something, dealing with the homelessness that's going on, or juvenile delinquency, things that police maybe don't have to deal with, right? So there's some benefits in it. It's also the case that although algorithms are biased, so are we. So judges use algorithms right now to decide if they want to, let's say post-trial, decide if they want the person to go to prison or if they want some kind of stay-at-home measure or some kind of rehabilitative thing. So it's used in sentencing. Okay. Well, in a pre-algorithm world, whatever is going on in that judge's head, you don't know. And if you tell him, I think you're biased, man. You're sending most of the Black folks to prison, and the white folks are going home with something around their ankles. I forgot what that thing's called.
Oh, monitor.
The monitor. That's right. Thanks. So you're being biased, man. So he'll say, no, I'm not. And you can't get in that person's head. But if we can see what's going on in the algorithms and tweak that algorithm, that's probably much better, because the algorithm can be open. So in the future, what we need to do is just make them better. Instead of them being these proprietary things where businesses lock them up, you know, we get to see how these decisions are made. And in that way, we can, as a public, work together to tweak those algorithms. So I'm a bit more positive about it than other folks.
All right, Dr. Roderick Graham, Associate Professor of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Old Dominion. Thank you so much for your time.
Appreciate it, brother.